Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of Pride Bahamas 2020. I hope everybody had a restful evening. The movie last night was excellent. Thank you for the choice of movie. Today, we're going to move on to part 3 of our Pride Bahamas sensitization and educational session. This morning, we are pleased to have with us, joining us for Pride Bahamas, is Joseph Gaskins Jr., affectionately called Joe. Many of us in our he has received a BA in politics. He also obtained a Master of Science in Psychology from the School of London of Economics. He's especially research. Joey has worked for nonprofits, organizations, and many political campaigns across the United States of America and here in Bahamas. How we welcome this morning Mr. Joey Gaskin Jr.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Bahamas. Thank you for inviting me here today. I want to first start by saying how proud I am to be participating in Pride this year amidst all the confusion and craziness that we are experiencing. I think it is important that we still find time to come together, to fellowship, to engage with each other and think through how we can make our country more inclusive, more welcoming place for all Bahamians and people that us. So I'm very thankful and proud to be a part of today's and this month's series of events. So I'm happy to be here. I was asked today to talk about inclusive policies and preventing LGBTQ plus discrimination. Policy is my love language, and politics, I often say, is my religion. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about this today. And I think it's something that we can all engage on. It's something that I think we should all be thinking about, not just as a part of the LGBTQ community, but also as Bahamians, because there's one thing that Bahamian governments and administrations time after time have not done well is policy making specifically. And given that reality, I wanted to start, as I usually do these conversations, with some questions, right, to help define how we can approach the topic at hand today. The title that I was given in my original intro letter was Inclusive Policies Preventing LGBTQ Discrimination. And I don't want to assume that people who are listening or watching us today understand what any of those terms mean. So what do we mean by policy, right? What does that mean? How do we make or engage in policy making? What do we mean by discrimination in this instance? And also, how can we make policy, or how can policymakers counter that discrimination? So I want to start from that very basic point in the discussion. I'm going to spend a significant amount of time kind of working through those terms to make sure that we have a kind of clear, strong foundation on which to have a larger conversation around preventing LGBTQ plus discrimination. I'm not coming with the answers here or policy solutions. My role in this instance, I think, is to generate some meaningful and informed conversation. So I want to start with that first question. What do we mean by policy? And this is something that, again, I've done for quite some time. But just last year, I spent a month in London doing a series of courses, one of which was a week-long course on policy planning, on strategic policy planning for government. Interesting course, and I'm going to draw a lot of information from there. And the way that we defined policy in that course is the process by which governments translate their vision into programs and actions to deliver outcomes, right? So I'm going to say that again. Policy is the process by which governments translate their vision. So they have to come to the table with a vision. into programs and actions, right? Actual activity to deliver outcomes. And those outcomes are desired, measurable changes in the real world around us. A lot of people, they mix terms that may not necessarily work the way that people think that they should work. And so you often hear policy, strategy, procedure, delivery, all kind of mixed up in one. And I wanna create some distinction. Strategy is the overall process of deciding where you wanna go and how to get there. That strategic direction is the desired future and what needs to be achieved to get there. But policy is the means by which we move in that direction. And it's really about selecting the most suitable policy tools to get us to where we want to be. So strategy is that overall process, that really deep engagement and deciding on where you want to go and how you want to get there. Strategic direction is the future and what needs to be achieved to get there. But policy is the means by which we move in that direction. And I think that distinction is important. And then, you know, the traditional policy-making process requires us to clarify our objectives. Is that me? Requires us to clarify our objectives, identify the options for achieving those objectives, right? Identifying the consequences, including all the side effects for each option, and then evaluating each set of consequences in terms of the objectives so that the best policy can be selected and implemented, right? So clarifying the objectives is really key here. Understanding exactly what it is that you want to accomplish. Understanding the full spectrum of options that you have for achieving those objectives. And then going down the line of that full spectrum and going, if I do X, here are the consequences, right? And here are some of the side effects that each policy option I have available to me will create. And then evaluating those set of consequences in terms of objectives so that we come to the best policy decision, right? And you can tell by that kind of very brief engagement that when we look at governments, successive governments in our country, throughout the region, and perhaps even our neighbors to the west of us right now, nobody's really doing kind of engaged or very deeply considered policy making. And I think if we're going to talk about what kinds of inclusive policies we can come up with to beat back or unpick or prevent discrimination for sexual minorities in the Bahamas, understanding that policy making process and what policy is going to be key. Okay. And that's a traditional policy-making process. We now have other policy-making processes that I am more inclined towards, which may be open policy-making, which is it requires much more public engagement. There's agile policy-making, which is less about how you execute policy-making and more about a kind of mindset and your engagement with policy-making. But there are a number of different ways to approach policy-making. We can talk about that later. But again, I want to stress that what is most important is clarifying your objectives at the beginning of the policy-making process. And I think this is why we have to take a second, take a breath, so that we better understand what we mean by discrimination, especially if ending or preventing it is our primary policy objective, right? And I think, you know, discrimination as a term seems very intuitive, but it's also a very broad term. And I also think that, you know, when we talk about discrimination, for a lot of us, particularly in the region, violence and other forms of blatant abuse against sexual minorities, whether that is physical abuse, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse, those things are top of mind. And it's quite interesting that that's the case, because you get a lot of denials from government officials and religious authorities here in the Bahamas that the Bahamian LGBTQ plus community does not experience those kinds of abuses, right? But if you're on Bahamian Twitter, you know that a few weeks ago, there was a day or two where queer Bahamians Bahamians who are sexual minorities, or Bahamians who were mistaken, because this is the other thing. You don't have to actually identify. You could just look like, or people can think you are a sexual minority to experience that kind of abuse and violence. Bahamians were, young Bahamians in particular, were spending time recounting their experiences publicly on Twitter. So we do know that these things happen in the Bahamas. And again, when we talk about discrimination, oftentimes the abuse and violence is top of mind. But in this instance, for this conversation, I kind of want to put violence aside for a second. And it's not that violence is unimportant, but that it gets a lot of the primary focus. And I think that there's an argument to be made that violence is a symptom, violence against sexual minorities is a symptom of more kind of banal, common forms of what we're talking about now, discrimination, right? So I'll throw in the pot here that may be more specific or may give us more meat to hold on to when we talk about policy making, right? But let's start with discrimination, all right? So discrimination, usually interchangeable with words like exclusion, unequal treatment, a kind of disadvantaging of a particular group of people, or differentiation, right? Very basic, okay? But let me throw a couple of other terms in here. And if you've ever heard me do a talk on sexual rights and sexual minorities, you know, I always reference Gregory Herrick's Beyond Homophobia, because I think homophobia as a term, while it has been useful, is too broad and not specific enough for the purpose of having these very in-depth conversations. And Herrick advances two terms that I think may be useful in this instance. One is sexual stigma, right? And that is the stigma that accompanies sexual intimacy, same-sex intimacy, specifically. In other words, it is the stigma that is represented when people look at same-sex intimacy as something that is inherently bad, sick, unnatural, or inferior, right? That is how we can define sexual stigma. It is where all of those feelings come from. And right underneath that sexual stigma is, of course, heterosexism, right? And heterosexism provides the rationale and the operating instructions, Herrick says, for how people engage with that stigma, right? In other words, the sexual stigma is oppositional. We understand same-sex intimacy to be inherently bad, sick, unnatural, and inferior because it is juxtaposed against heterosexuality and the primacy of heterosexism, right? Or heterosexuality, okay? And then the other term that I want to throw in the mix is sexual prejudice. And this connects hostility towards sexual minorities to an extensive body of social science research, right? Sexual prejudice is something that social scientists, psychologists, sociologists, and even anthropologists have been studying from some time. And connecting that work to what sexual minorities experience is really important for understanding the phenomenon. And prejudice has three kind of very basic and simple components to it. There's an attitude, usually negative or positive. That attitude is typically held towards a particular social group and its members in its entirety, right? With a few, perhaps sometimes, a few exceptions. And in this instance, and in this use of prejudice, the attitude is typically negative. That's a simple but practical framing for people like social psychologists, because attitude is a psychological construct. And sexual prejudice, like other attitudes, is internal. It's inside a person's head. It cannot be directly observed. It has to be inferred from particular kinds of behavior. And such behavior could consist of verbal expression, like an opinion or belief, or a response to a survey from an interviewer. But that prejudice can also have material effects on the person who's being prejudiced, right? Or who is experiencing that prejudice. And that could mean, discrimination. That could mean being left out. That could mean being abused even. And so when I initially said that violence, it could be considered a kind of symptom, I think that there's an argument to be advanced that things like sexual stigma and prejudice are at the root of the violent abuse that sexual minorities face in the Bahamas, but also around the world. And perhaps when we talk about policy solutions, it should be, or we should be considering pointing those policy solutions at that root, right? The other thing is sexual prejudice can be inferred from nonverbal behavior. Of course, as we know, actions such as avoiding gay men and women in a social setting, voting for anti-gay propositions on ballots or for anti-gay candidates, and at the extreme, of course, perpetrating an act of anti-gay violence or anti-gay discrimination. And although these behaviors can be used to infer an individual's attitude, they are not themselves an attitude. And so it's the attitude that is at the root of the behavior. And unfortunately for us, as we kind of think through this, behaviors and attitudes, the relationships between the two can be quite complicated. And a negative attitude or a prejudiced attitude does not necessarily lead to negative or discriminatory behaviors. But what we do know is that across time and across situations, folks with high levels of sexual prejudice can be expected to negatively interact with or negatively respond to sexual minorities. So while the relationship is complicated and not entirely correlated, we know that over time and across situations, these attitudes of sexual stigma and prejudice lead to behaviors that can damage, hurt, or be discriminatory against sexual minorities. So developing strategies to reduce prejudice and stigma can have an impact on anti-gay actions over time, even though these actions, these strategies may not always influence behavior in specific situations, right? So given all of this, the point that I'm making here is that we have to be very clear about our policy objectives, right? Are we interested in preventing discrimination and other negative behaviors? Are there specific situations in which discrimination is more common for sexual minorities in the Bahamas? For example, like in healthcare, education, housing, and employment? Do we need to unpick the existing stigma and prejudice that drives these discriminatory behaviors? Or is it all of the above? And if we look back at policymaking as a process, its first most important point, as I've been making to this entire talk, is to define those objectives. There are some starting questions, right? But each of those questions that I just asked consider different objectives. If we're looking at discrimination, it would require eliminating inequity or exclusion. If we're looking at beating back or unpicking sexual stigma, it might require policies that sensitize and educate. If we're looking at sexual prejudice, it might require policies that shift attitudes. Or if we're looking to build a set of policies that address all of the above, it would have to be a combination of all of those things, right? Similarly, we have to decide at what level these policies operate. Do they operate at the personal level, directed at changing attitudes of individuals? Are we operating on the organizational level, concerning attitudinal barriers and domains such as employment, education, and health? Or are we at the government level, which would require legally mandating behavior change? Now, each of those objectives requires a different approach, and we need to make sense of those objectives. To do this, I think we have to connect the policy-making process to the lived experiences of Bahamian sexual minorities so that we can narrow our focus on what needs to be accomplished here. So I think, to end, some of our starting questions have to be, what is the real problem to be addressed in the Bahamas when it comes to sexual minorities, right? What are the real needs of the policy users or those who will benefit from the policy? What is the rationale for action to address it, right? And there's some interesting work, for example, going on by Open Work, an American organization, looking at how LGBTQ discrimination may affect Caribbean economies. What is the rationale for the action? Perhaps the rationale is not just that we are economic units, or that we, countries need to make money, but maybe based simply in the fact that sexual minorities are humans and deserve to be treated like people, right? But we also need to ask the question, what will success look like at the end of these policies? And then who needs to contribute? Who needs to be involved in addressing all of these things that we have discussed? How do we engage the people who will use it, who the policy will work on, who will have to administer the policy? How can we engage them in this process? And so just to conclude, we've kind of solidly defined what policy making is and what policy is. We need to make a decision, I think, as a community, about what is it that we want to address in our policy making endeavors, right? And who we want to include. And I think the best way for us to do that is to begin asking some of the questions that we ended with, right? And most of all, I think the key question in this moment is, what is the real problem at home in the Bahamas that we need to address? And I think if we can start there, we can begin to build policies that drive inclusion, that prevent discrimination, and that can unpick some of the sexual stigma and prejudice that sexual minorities in the Bahamas face on a regular basis. And I'm going to pause there so we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Joey, for that excellent presentation of where we need to go and what we need to do. So we will open the floor now for questions. Anybody that will have a question for Joey, where do we take it? How do we move forward? The floor is now open.
I'll start. So you talked about engaging with the policy process, right? So something that's happening right now, or it actually just closed, I was looking at, and I was having a conversation with Alexis about the need for, in the statistics survey that's supposed to be coming up, for there to be questions that include LGBTQ people. So, because we are citizens of the country as well, so therefore we need questions about us in that survey, right? So that we can identify how many, so we can have actual statistics or numbers about how many actual LGBTQ people exist in the Bahamas. They're working, the regular questions. I was looking to the United States for some, I guess, a kind of way to frame, I guess, what I was trying to do. So I went looking at the ministry's website, and they opened up for 1 month only suggestions towards a bill that's supposed to be enacted, the 2020 bill, because they're reforming the bill, right? And from September 1st to September 30th was the only time frame that they gave for Bahamians to contribute to that bill. And for me, that 1 month is not enough to have engagement with people. And so, I mean, the date is passed, but I'm kind of still thinking about writing something, putting something down, but it's, time, when you're busy and you got all kind of stuff to do. So I've been trying to put that together, because I really think that that's one way we need to engage, because we need the statistics. We need to be able to quantify the representation that we have, instead of them saying, oh, well, it's just 1% of the population, and we're using American statistics to kind of frame that. What can we do in terms of, I guess, that kind of engagement? How do we get them to understand that they need to be more engaging, not only with us, but the wider Bahamian public, because 1 month is simply not enough.
Yeah. Are you talking about the census?
Yes,
the census. Yes. Okay. Yes. So I mean, I think that this is a good point, particularly as we talk about the mechanics of policymaking, right? In the work that we do at the firm and the work that I do on a regular basis, we believe that policy strategies, whatever it is that you're working on, should be informed by statistical data, well, quantitative and qualitative. For those folks who don't know, just very simply, quantitative would be things like surveys that say 65% of so-and-so believe, and then qualitative would be much more involved in understanding the language that people are using. It's deeper dive into people's attitudes, beliefs, feelings, right? and qualitative and quantitative data. The census is a really important tool for this, particularly because censuses give governments their governing rationale to a certain extent, right? So governments understand how to cordon off or put aside resources, make policy change and legislation on this, how the census helps them understand the population there is. And so I think absolutely right. And you're seeing similar arguments being made in the US about undocumented residents in the US, also, but also minority US as well, where the effort being led by conservatives right now, ensuring that those voices, or trying to ensure that those voices are left out of the census, which in turn means that they get their fair share of focus, right? As government begins to make policy. So I think that on the one hand, the census is an important tool that we should be involved in. And I would encourage you, if we can engage on that. But I think the other thing is, as a community, we need to do that work ourselves. And the reason why I'm saying that is not because it's our responsibility, because it's all of our responsibility as Bahamians to better understand who we are, but also because in the research work that needs to be done, and given the kind of environment in which sexual minorities live in the Bahamas, having government workers ask the questions that need to be asked will likely skew downward any results. Why is that? Because as we all know, sexual minorities in the Bahamas may be less inclined to openly identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or whatever other identity they may identify with publicly or to a stranger, for obvious reasons. We could go through it, but it's there. And so I think that there is an opportunity, and you know, we should encourage larger multilaterals who do this kind of research work all the time, like the IDB, the IMF, the World Bank, who all have initiatives around this kind of work now, to help us fund a really well done research project on the lives, the existence of LGBTQ plus people in the Bahamas, because we get a sense of where discrimination, and there is some information around this already, by the way, but where discrimination is most prevalent, right? Because again, violence gets a lot of the attention, but I imagine, and I would guess this, that LGBTQ people experience a lot of healthcare discrimination. We know that young people who are either openly or obviously queer, or may appear to be obviously queer, suffer from abuses in the education system. So I think we need to identify where that discrimination, where that sexual prejudice and stigma is most prevalent, and target our efforts there. And again, it's quite interesting because of course our opponents on this, the opponents who are opposed to inclusivity, opposed to giving sexual minorities their just due as it relates to rights, will always focus the attention, for example, on marriage, when that may not be the primary issue for Bahamian sexual minorities, right? It may be something more fundamental, like I want to be able to apply for a job and know that despite my qualifications, I'm not being discriminated against because I'm a sexual minority. That may be the key. And so I think to kind of summarize, the census is an important tool that I think, you know, we need to have a voice in, but also I think there's a lot of work that we can be doing to identify, characterize, and frame the experience of sexual minorities in the Bahamas. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else with questions? If not, thank you very much, Joey, for providing us with the know-how and the skills that we need to move forward as a community here and as citizens of the Bahamas. We know you come with a wealth of knowledge, and I would personally like to thank you for guiding me through this process of how to engage with the government what to say and what not to say. And I truly would like to publicly thank you for that.
Thank you.
So
Thank
on
you.
behalf of the DeMarco organization, I say thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alexis. And again, proud and happy to be here. And you know, you can always call on me when you need me. All right.
Thank you very much. So at this time, we'll get ready for our next session, what is Let's Talk About Us. It's a trans panel that we will be discussing with our regional advocates, our trans community. The link will be shared via our Facebook page, and it's also shared in your email addresses. So we'll prepare for the next panel. Thank you for joining us. See you at our next session.